Let's talk about oil and conflict. I came of age during the first Iraq War, in which there was a widespread understanding that the reason why the Iraqi government invaded neighboring Kuwait was because of the oil resources that were being produced in Kuwait during the Iran and Iraq War in the 80s. Before then, oil production and the susceptibility of it to attack during the conflict ended up raising prices and instability in global markets. I think oil production is one of those few robust correlates of regime type that if you have oil production, the country is likely to stay at whatever kind of institutions helped generate it. It's a predictor of regime stability for both democracies and autocracies, that you have an increase in corruption that can enable autocracies to maintain themselves. Saudi Arabia is going to be an example of that I'm going to be talking about in this video, which kind of makes me think about the Red Sea, especially this boat here on fire. Do you remember when that evergreen boat ran aground in the Suez Canal last year that ended up halting large amount of global trade for over a month while it was stuck in the Suez Canal, the Evergrande? One of their other boats of the Evergreen Corporation you might not have heard about here in Australia, but it was stuck in the mud in Chesapeake Bay near Washington, D.C. Only was stuck in the mud for a month. Same company, different boat, stuck in the mud, causing disruption for a little over a month. It was just freed in mid-April. So these global shipping challenges for oil as well as for other resources is a challenge, despite the fact that we have a streamlined globalized system. So how can oil be connected to conflict? It is, as I mentioned in the last video, a reciprocal relationship, that conflict can increase natural resource dependence and price as well as rents in a number of different areas around the world, starting from the U.S. Civil War in the 19th century and going through to the Syrian Civil War, the Iraq War in our century, that you see the price of oil responding to as well as driving a lot of international politics. And it is something that's important to understand for both the government sector as well as potentially making it a target for attacks by those who might be unhappy with the current government's policies, connecting to the Saudi Arabia, as I was talking about, from attacks a couple of years ago. I think Saudi Arabia is an example as one of the world's largest oil producers, of a country that's benefited quite dramatically from the export of oil. It's enabled a huge amount of development in the country, resources going to individual citizens, influence in the Middle East as well as the rest of the world. Close connections with the U.S. and other Western parties. However, the oil, it's also recognized, is not likely to last forever, might not get us to the end of the century. And so Saudi Arabia has taken efforts to try to diversify their economy, open up for foreign tourists for the first time a couple of years ago. Unless you had a specific visa to work as a job there, it was impossible to get into. I remember when I used to read stories about travel before I really could travel. I used to read lots of stories about travel. Of course, problematic 19th century British explorers, which I didn't fully understand the effect that the British government, as well as the perspectives of the explorers and their relationships to the locals, as problematic as they were. I think Richard Francis Burton was a bit different in his abilities to try to learn the language and get in touch with the culture. He wrote a book about his experiences in learning Arabic and going into the country, being pretending to be a merchant, and his stories of Mecca and Medina from an outsider's perspective was quite influential in the 19th century. Now it is more open to tourism, of course, not certain parts of Mecca, but it is an effort to try to diversify. Same with the UAE as well. You have these oil producers that are trying to diversify as well. Of course, the resources that they have had has enabled them to have influence in the region, often because of their purchases of weapons that allows them to maintain their security domestically as well as exert power in the region. The U.S. Under President Trump sealed a huge military weapons deal. Saudi Arabia has been traditionally one of the largest purchasers of weapons in the Middle East, followed quite distantly by Egypt, and that is enabling them to have influence both in their relationships with their major rivals with Iran, but then also in other countries in the region, which we'll get through in a second. I do wanted to just push a couple of other potential areas in which this oil production can give countries influence. One is on oil prices. OPEC was oil-producing, exporting countries banded together to try to reduce the instability of oil prices, as we've seen already in this class. However, they can also violate those OPEC agreements by exporting more oil to reduce those prices, which could have an effect on other destination countries. This also can allow some countries to maintain some kind of ongoing ties, even if they do things that would be indescribable if other countries were able to do it, including killing a journalist. Khashoggi a couple of years ago, you don't really hear that much about him now. Saudi Arabia has tried to move on from the criticism of that assassination. The Saudi Crown Prince has had some form of responsibility for that. However, he still can have other exertions of power and causing many more deaths than just one journalist, but ones that don't get in the media as much. And that is in the ongoing civil war in Yemen. The president just stepped down recently, but there is a Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis in that kind of border region in neighboring Yemen, and the war crimes have there's been records of them, and as well as, unfortunately, a number of weapons that were exploded in Yemen that the people in those villages and areas, in trying to extract them, see that they were produced in the United States, and that, of course, has a more visceral impact on people's views of major weapons exporting countries when you can see the use of them against civilians in a number of contexts. However, the Saudi government being defined as an autocratic state, according to every measure that I'm familiar with, it has been an incredibly stable one. And you look at this graph from the Michael Ross article looking at oil income per capita in states around the world and their time under democratic rule. You have a whole host of Middle Eastern states that are heavy petroleum exporters that haven't had any kind of experience with democratic rule. And so you can see how that might be at one point in time. This is kind of a snapshot cross-sectionally between 1960 and 2008, but you can also look at it over time as well, that as the norms of what kind of political institutions citizens should be able to have or to choose for their own countries has changed from a low point in the late 60s and early 70s up through the end of the Cold War, that you have oil producers were always laggards, less likely to be democratic according to this polity score graph here. And that also can fluctuate with the commodity prices, as we've talked about already. So this is a brief example of how oil can buy resources, it can buy influence, it can buy weapons, it can buy stability within strong autocratic systems or democratic systems, again, the evidence suggests it's in those countries that have some middle ground or a dependence without the capabilities to maintain those buffers, like with the sovereign wealth fund in Saudi Arabia. It can increase the chance of conflict in those countries that are dependent on those resources but don't have the state capacity. Leading to the third lecture question for today, trying to connect it to your own lives. Do you know where the oil that we depend on in Canberra comes from? I know most of you are in Canberra, some of you are not. You can Google this recent article in The Conversation that shows where Australians' petrol comes from, and it makes me at least think about the potential for petrol supply production in Australia. Australia is the exception of all developed OECD country states in not having a 90-day reserve of petrol. Do you think the international sources of disruption, like the Russian conflict, now with the markets roiled by the EU increasingly, I think just about to pass an embargo on Russian oil exports and natural gas exports, do you think this is something that requires domestic processes to address in 2022, given the disruptions we've seen in the last couple of years? Are these disruptions in this most basic kind of resource something that we need to focus on, or do you think there already are processes in place by the Australian government to be able to protect from it? Interested in your take? Feel free to leave comments below or in the Waddle page for those students taking my class. Now I wanted to talk about oil and conflict in one specific country, and that would be South Sudan. I have one longer video and a couple of brief news snippets about South Sudan. Another one of those cases like Turkmenistan in which there isn't that much international media coverage of it in English language outlets. This brief, I think 14-minute Vice video is as good of an introduction to the costs on the ground of oil production and conflict, as well as the connections to corruption. So you see the reporter speaking to individual leaders as well as individuals. Stay for the end of the video, in which you have a young person separated from his family by conflict for years, finally reunited, and if there's a dry eye in the house, it definitely wasn't in this house. So watch those videos. I think it connects a lot of these high-level mechanisms of relations between natural resources, corruption, conflict, political systems, and makes it, I think, a lot more real. Be interested to hear your guys' take in the workshops. And with that, I will turn it over from oil and conflict to the discussion of South Sudan, the world's newest country, independent since 2011.